Welcome to On the Horn with leader Dick Armey. I'm your host, Gary Emineth. This will be episode number 5. We've been doing a series of episodes dealing with leader Armey. He's grown up in North Dakota. At time as an economist in the education system around universities around the country. But then he gets involved in politics. And last episode number 4, we were dealing with leader Armey helping architect the takeover of Congress by Republicans in 1994, coming into majority. But there were too many other things I wanted to talk about. So we're going to continue with that. And Leader Armey, welcome back to On the Horn.
It's nice to be back.
So Leader Armey, there were so many things going on, the contrast between when you're in the minority versus in the majority. And Bill Clinton, so 1994, Bill Clinton is president. And he had big initiatives coming on in that whole scenario. Newt Gingrich and the leadership. Talk to us a little bit about the leadership team in Congress that had to be now in the majority when they've been used to operating in the minority.
You mean our leadership team after we took the majority?
Yes.
Well, really, quite frankly, it really amounted to Newt and myself. We had an excellent division of labor. Newt was very good at politics and loved ceremonial matters. I despised both politics and ceremony, but I was committed to legislation. So I handled the legislative side of matters, and Newt handled everything else. There's a great division of labor, worked very well. Quite frankly, there was very little contribution that was really made to what was actually getting things done by the other members of the leadership.
So when it came time that we talked last time about the Contract of America and zeroing in on that and executing that in 100 days, which is quite remarkable. And that's what you're really talking about, the process and how taking it serious and working it through the committees. Those are all, it's complicated process, and it doesn't work if you're a rookie. You've had to been there a while to understand the workings that gets complicated. When I've read about it or I hear about it, the way the House works, it's tricky.
I had made up my mind before I even got to Washington. I need to understand the institution. I need to understand its procedures, its protocols, its mores. And I was really quite well equipped to do that because we really had to manage several different committees. We had to line up our work and get things in order so that one would follow upon the other. Quite frankly, the initial inspiration for my organizing a series of jobs in unison with one another was from Mike Berg, my construction foreman back in Candid, North Dakota. I used to marvel at the way he would line up the work, assign responsibilities in accordance with people's different abilities, and just keep the thing moving forward. When Newt asked me, how did you do that in 100 days? Where did you learn that? I said, I learned it from Mike Berg in Candid, North Dakota. All the years that I'd been going through with the BRAC legislation and other things that I worked on, that I understood those protocols, I think, far better than most people, and was able to see the procedure by which we'd have to build a kind of like putting a string of beads together. One must follow the other, and it must be in an orderly fashion. Yeah, it was a fun period of time. We had some hitches in to get along the way, and we had to probably put the spurs to a person here and there, but we managed to get them done. It was really quite a remarkable accomplishment.
You had mentioned in your book that the 4 years from, I think, 94 through 98, that window of 4 years, the House kind of ran the show in Washington, D.C., and really that's not typical, was it?
No, it really wasn't. We had a real purpose. We had it pretty well defined and spelled out in good detail, and we had a lot of initiative. We were the innovators. We were the entrepreneur. We were the hard-charging point of the spear. And everybody either had, the choice was either to follow or get out of the way.
You had made the comment in your book that most members of Congress are natural-born followers and inconvenience minimizers who just go with the flow, risking nothing but the one finger into the wind. Do you think that's still true today?
I think it's probably even worse today. I'm not sure. I try to keep up a little bit, and I notice we have some legislative entrepreneurs in Congress. But most of them are pretty much the same thing, taking up space, getting their plaudits, bring home a little pork to the folks back home, do your committee work, but don't put yourself in any position of strenuous work or inconvenience. And part of it is very simple. Members of Congress do not live with the consequences of their work. And because they don't have the incentive system that you and I have and everybody else in the world when we're at work. Thomas Sowell has a great line. He says, I can't think of a more foolish way to make decisions than to put them into the hands of people who don't live with the consequences of those decisions.
Wow, that's incredible. That's so insightful. You talked also about so often in legislation, the way Congress looks with the finger in the wind and the way they process stuff, about the law of unintended consequences. Talk to us a little bit about what you mean by that in Washington, because that's so true a lot of times in business. You make a decision for the wrong reasons. Talk to us a little bit about that.
It's really an alibi. When things don't work out, and they work out badly as many predicted, then they say, it's not my fault, it's just the law of unintended consequences, as if some kind of an invisible foot came in here and kicked us around, and we were really full of good intentions. I go back to Thomas Sowell again. A foolish way to judge any idea is to judge it by its intentions. You should look at its results. The law, I always used to tell them that there was never an unintended consequence that wasn't an unforecasted consequence. You knew this could happen. You knew it was most likely to happen. And you had the boundaries, you did it anyway. Now you're coming back and blaming it on some ghostly figure out there.
I want to pivot and get very specific to Bill Clinton and his wife, Hillary. Hillary obviously had this, Bill wanted to deal with health care reform. Obviously, we deal with it with Obama years later. But Bill Clinton took that on and appoints his wife to head it up. And I'm not sure what the wisdom was. I think she's a pretty smart lady. I would not want to get in the crosshairs of her. But talk to us a little bit about the health care and Hillary's role. And you had to interview her at different times and the kind of personality, what she was like.
I always pointed out, Bill Clinton was not much of an ideological guy. He was pretty much a practical person, and frankly, he had far better good intentions than what we understood and credited him with. Hillary, the ideological side of the marriage came out of Hillary. She was a hardcore leftist. I think there were things going on in their personal relationships where she just put the hammer down. If you want me to play the good wife and be supportive in public and so forth, you better give me something of significant authority around here. It was an extraordinary thing. Never before, I believe, in the history of the nation did the president put his wife in charge of a major piece of legislative action. This is not an elected official, and I thought it was quite remarkable, but she took it hard to the left, just as we would have expected with Hillary. And Bill Clinton, President Clinton, I think basically he said, look, I've got her occupied over there. She can spew her venom there, and got her kind of out of my bag so I can go ahead with my own business.
So you had developed a chart, or you had helped promote a chart that helped identify and explain her health care plan. Talk to us about the chart.
Yeah, the chart really blasted it, and it was gratifying. I felt a lot of vindication when she sighed in a post-failure interview. We never could overcome the chart. But the chart was a good innovation, and it got a lot of traction and did a lot of good. And it would quickly propel me to be the person of the first biggest architect of Hillary Claire. And I was probably the only person that would treat her on a professional basis rather than pandering to her. And I think her staff warned her about that. Look out for this guy. He's a tough guy, and he'll stick to the subject and put your feet in the fire. And I don't think she was particularly anxious to have that happen.
I recall one of the comments when you were talking about her wit and about her how polite she was and her power in Washington. Do you recall that scenario when you were interviewing her?
Yeah, it was my turn on the committee, and of course everybody in the committee was swooning over her, pandering her, and I think her staff had forewarned her about me. And so when I opened up my term, I said to Mr. Clinton, while I don't share your enthusiasm for state-run healthcare, I do want to try to make this an interesting debate. Then she shoots back, yeah, you and Dr. Kevorkian. Of course, the room erupted into applause and laughter because in that particular room, there weren't very many people who liked me, and there were very few that would show it in front of the others. So while the uproar was going on and everybody was celebrating her, I leaned back in my chair. Now, this is a true fact. As I leaned back, I remembered my mother telling me at a time when I was younger, when she saw a young girl slap me and me do nothing about it. She asked me, I said, look, you don't slap girls. And she said, if the girl's in the wrong and you're in the right, you slap her back. So then I leaned forward in a chair, and where most people would have been dead in their tracks after that onslaught. But I just said, Mrs. Clinton, I have heard many reports in this town about your wit and charm. Let me just tell you, I believe the reports about your wit are understated and the reports about your charm are overstated. She said, thank you. And the whole part of that whole exchange, the only thing the newspapers reported was Armey who said Mrs. Clinton's reports of her charm were overstated. That's the only part that they put out there. It's just so predictable. So
Yeah,
it didn't matter.
that's so typical.
The main thing was I didn't let her give me a sucker punch and knock me out of the conversation.
Yeah, that's fabulous. That's a great story. I just needed the people to hear that. We're going to go to the break. We come back. We're going to talk about President Clinton, President Reagan, President Bush, and all your scenarios of the various presidents. Leader Armey, we got a quote that you made about Hillary Clinton. Let's take a look at that. What do you have to say about that quote?
I believe that history has proven I was correct in my observation. I don't think there are very many people today that deny her affinity for Marxism.
That's awesome. That's absolutely true. I would guess most of the viewers on Open Rage and on the Horn with you would agree with that. So I want to talk a bit about the president. So when you came in, you had Ronald Reagan. And then I guess I would think we went from Ronald Reagan to George Bush 41 Sr., Bill Clinton, and then, of course, George Bush 43, who is running about kind of the end of this cycle here. So talk to us a little bit about the different presidencies and your impressions of these various presidents and having worked with them.
Reagan was a very serious man with a very broad-based sense of purpose in his office, but he was also a man of wonderful demeanor. He was so well-natured and such a joy to be around that it really worked well for him, helped him a lot. But this was a serious adult. His purposes in the presidency had gone back probably as far as his childhood. He wanted to make America better. That was his only purpose, and he was really devoted to it. I was a little bit in awe of Reagan. I'm not prone to be that way, but because he was such a completely good man and he had such completely wholesome purposes in life, and he seemed to have so much fidelity to those purposes, he ought to be that kind of a guy. So Reagan, yes, to me, he's the top, he's the aces. We want to go on. I don't think there was anybody that compared to him. If President Trump had his demeanor and his good nature, he might compare with him, because I think what Trump does many good things, he just doesn't look good doing that.
Yeah, boy, that's a fact. And he just can't help himself. He just sometimes he'll be in the middle of something that he's got momentum, and all of a sudden something comes out with a left hook, and I'm going, he just can't hardly stand. He can't seem to stand success somehow, but he's been very successful. So let's talk about George Bush 41, George Herbert Walker Bush. What's your impression of him?
This was a man who had only one purpose, to be president. But he had no idea what it is he would like to accomplish in the presidency. And when I watched his lackadaisical attitude towards his reelection, to me, it seemed as though I've done everything I wanted to do. I wanted to be president. I am president. There's not much more So he didn't have the inspiration to go forward. He was almost indifferent to his reelection. And quite frankly, I don't think he accommodated. Now, his handling of the first Gulf War, I thought that was a good and impressive diplomatic effort. And the one thing I gave him credit for, he went in there, he got Saddam out of there, and then he stopped where he said he would stop. Now, a lot of people didn't applaud him for that, but that's what the whole coalition was built upon, that plan and that objective. So that the one thing that I probably give him some credit for, and maybe even have a bit of an admiration for, is that. Other than that, I didn't see much in George Herbert Walker Bush to, what should I say, that to attract me.
And I recall that there was a couple little scuff-ups between you and him and his campaign team about raising taxes. And he said, read my lips. And I was there at that convention in New Orleans when he had Dan Quayle come in and running through that, no new taxes. And you called him out on it, and you were spot on with that.
Yeah, I had some inside dope. Leon Panetta had told me before he was even sworn in that he and Dick Darman had a plan for him to raise taxes the second year of his presidency. And of course, I thought that was bad public policy, but I was certain it would end his presidency, and I told him that. And I was the first person to tell him he would be a one-term president. He didn't like that. Loyalty to the Bush family, loyalty means you praise me. And that doesn't have much meaning that went beyond that. So he just saw me as some kind of a smart aleck and way out of my league and with no right to talk to him that way. And we didn't get along well at all. He had no respect for me and I had no respect for him.
Okay, let's talk about Bill Clinton. I had someone tell me one time that was, I would say they were apolitical, but they were around, I think more on a spiritual level. There would be events or something, and Bill Clinton came, and he said when Bill Clinton walked in that room, the place lit up. You could tell he was in charge. Now, I don't know if that was your experience, the way his persona was, but talk to us a little bit about working with him and what your take on him was, besides philosophical, of course. I'd love to hear that as well.
The first time the press asked me about Bill Clinton, I said, he's very engaging, and he was. And he had a certain charisma about him. He had purposes for his presidency, most particularly to balance the budget and to do welfare reform. We never fully appreciated him on that point. He deserved greater regard on us. He had, in fact, a greater sincerity of purpose in that regard than we ever recognized. In the end, he got both done, but I judge him as a frivolous man in his personal life, but a fairly serious and effective man in the presidency. I could probably rank him very closer behind Reagan than anybody, with the possible exception of the current president.
Trump.
Yeah, Trump. But Trump's so busy getting in his own way, and it's hard for us to appreciate the good things he does. He does many good things. And like I said, he just doesn't look good doing it. Bill Clinton was overcome with his personal, what should I say, bad behavior.
The whole idea of his personal life getting in the way with Monica Lewinsky and the whole scandal around that really tore him down. I am shocked how he survived it. Probably the only thing that helped him was probably Newt Gingrich probably helped him survive it. The way I look at it, when I look at their both personal lives and what went on, the way they looked at the world, maybe I'm wrong.
I think he proved to us the political effectiveness of audacity. He had the so what campaign. So what? You knew I was a shirt chaser when you elected me. So what? I thought the blue dress would kill him dead, but he managed to overcome that. I remember when the blue dress came out, everybody was counting him out, and one member of the press was trying to get me to be empathic with him, to feel bad for him. How could I feel bad for the man and still be loyal to my own wife? They said, finally, one of them in frustration said, put yourself in that position. I said, I wouldn't be in that position. I'd be looking up from a pool of blood and hearing my wife ask, how do I reload this damn thing?
As you were talking, what was going through my mind is, I think what's helped him was Hillary was so unlikable by so many people that people, I think, felt sorry for him to some degree. And so you just nailed it. That's what was going through my mind as you were describing that.
Right. Yeah. I don't know. I just don't understand people that have so much responsibility and so much privilege, so much authority in such an important role, frivolously wasting it on themselves and their little juvenile pleasures. I just thought something I can comprehend.
So he was a pretty smart cookie, though, wasn't he?
I think he was pretty smart. I don't know that he was extraordinarily smart. I think reports of both he and Newt's super intelligence were a bit exaggerated. They used to say, well, Bill Clinton and Al Gore were Rhodes Scholars. And I said, big deal. I've seen the Rhodes in Tennessee and Arkansas, and they don't impress me that much.
That's a great line. I was a pretty smart guy that had something nice to say about you. I was going to talk about a little later in it, but what do you have to say about Alan Greenspan? Tell us about Alan Greenspan, what he thought of you.
Oh, Alan Greenspan, he told his wife that I was the smartest man in Congress. I had always admired Alan Greenspan. He's a free market economist, and I enjoyed the few encounters I had with him, but I remember in a big international banking convention in Paris, France, somebody asked him a question about the IMF. I was in a big fight with the IMF at the time. And Alan Greenspan says, the fate of the IMF rests with Dick Armey. And of course, nobody knew who I was except one of my former students who happened to be the president of the most significant bank in the Middle East. He said, I know Dick Armey. So he calls me up, he says, you made me famous. But I always felt complimented that Alan would think that much of me. I think he was a very bright man, and he served in that role, I think, pretty effectively.
One last thing before we go to the break. The whole independence of the Federal Reserve and his role compared to what's going on today with Trump leaning on what's going on, it's a concern that I'd love to get your perspective. We're going to go to the break, and we come back. I'd like to have you respond to the independence of that way the Federal Reserve and the monetary system works as an economist. So we're just trying to deal with the whole Federal Reserve, and we're talking about Alan Greenspan and the raising of interest rates and Trump's pressure to interject, I think, sometimes politics too much into it. Can you talk to us about that? And then a follow-up question, if you just want to go with that, is the whole Federal Reserve and our monetary system and that whole, it's scaring a lot of people right now. Talk to us a little bit about that independence, and are they truly?
The Federal Reserve should be technically competent and politically aloof. It was intended that way, and it needs to be that way. It has a simple task: to maintain an appropriate supply of money to accommodate to the transactions of the economy. Remember, money is just like the oil in your machine. If you got the right amount of the oil and the right kind of oil, it makes the machine run smoothly. That's all it's supposed to be. If you overfill your oil pan, you're going to burn oil. And that's what happens when you overfill the money supply. So I think the proudest moment I observed of the Federal Reserve was way back when William McChesney Martin just told Lyndon Baines Johnson, no, you don't control the international or the Federal Reserve. And it should be technically sound and maintained. Now, Friedman suggested a rule that said the government supply, the money supply should grow at a given rate. But this is to politicize that. Remember, almost all political decisions have a hidden agenda and end up with unintended consequences. That's why I say Armey's axiom number one, the market's rational, the government's dumb. No, I think Alan did the best he could, but it's grown way too political over the years. And I'd like to see it set right.
I've read something recently about in 2008 and 9, there was always some constraint on basically putting money into the economy. I recall sitting with my father-in-law one time watching the news, and he's over COVID, said the Federal Reserve just put in I think it was Federal Reserve, that would be the right agency, $3.5 trillion into the economy. And he said, where did that come from? I said, they just out of thin air, They made it happen. 2 weeks later,
Well, that's it.
And 2 weeks later, it
It's
said
true.
if the Federal Reserve just put $5.6 trillion into the economy to help the banking system, he goes, where did that come from? I said, the same place the other stuff came from. And talk to us a little bit about that, because I don't think everybody understands the implications of that.
Yeah, it's technically just accounting entries and so forth. You just expand the money supply. What is needed here is a disciplined integrity and a singular sense of purpose. And we're not supposed to solve the world's problems with the manipulation of the money supply. We're supposed to maintain a money supply that is a servant to the real economy and maintains its fluidity of transactions. And I think Keynesians, not Keynes himself, I think Keynes was far better man than he's understood to be today, but the Keynesians just exploded. They see this as another political instrument that I can manipulate for whatever power purpose I have for myself. And I think a disciplined integrity in the management of the money supply, this is frankly, in many respects, the best money system you could have if you do it correctly. But it's possible that maybe human beings can never have the discipline to do the big jobs, important jobs, the stabilizing jobs with the kind of integrity we must have. I would say probably the most remarkable thing is the money supply works pretty well despite of the human folly.
Interesting. In your book, and I wanted to take enough time, you talked at length about the Great Depression and kind of the things that came out of it, and related to how policy changed with the liberals and Roosevelt. And you've referred to a book that we have on our bookshelf. My wife's great at finding all these great books, and you listed one, The Forgotten Man by Amity Shales. And that's a fabulous book. I've referred to it multiple times in my TV show and on radio. Fabulous book. Talk to us about your perspective of where it went wrong during the Depression, because if things ever get bad again, people are going to panic. But how do they, I think understanding that is important, and what you have to say, I think, is very important.
He did a great job. I was privileged to know her, or I am, and it's an extremely important book. Essentially what happened was the left, the liberals, which of course would be almost center today, but by comparison with today's liberals, they seized the opportunity of the Great Depression to expand the size and scope of the government and so forth. Most of the problems, quite frankly, were consequential to bad public policy. Not an expert on the Great Depression, but it's pretty clear to me that the policies created long-term institutions that are an abomination and extraordinarily wasteful of human resources, while they did very little to get us out of the Depression. What got us out of the Depression was a war.
You had made the statement that government tends to write solutions, 100% solutions for 10% problems.
Yeah, I like that line. Bill Graham loved that line. But they do. All right, for example, if you take the notion of, let's see if we could find a way to provide some retirement security for the older Americans who are not so well off. All right, let us focus on the population of intent. What they did, they wrote Social Security for everybody. You can't get out of it. You can't avoid it. And for the average working man and woman today, it's the worst investment he makes of his money. And it isn't what he'd do voluntarily. He's forced to put his money into the worst retirement program in the history of the world, which is, by the way, a Ponzi scheme. All right. Now, why do you have to have it? Medicare, same thing. I thought during the great debate on Medicare in 1956, or when it gets worse, or 66, I thought it's a good idea. We can find ways to give health care to the elderly. But now they require you all to be in it, whether you need it or not. So what is this about? Is it really about taking care of the health care needs of the needy or is it about government control of everybody? And quite frankly, it's extremely costly. I tried to stay out of Medicare. And basically I was told, look, if you stay out of Medicare, we'll take away your Social Security. Now, I thought they would give me a pat on the back and thank me for relieving them of the extra costly burden. But no, they didn't. They wanted me in, whether I wanted to be in or needed to be in or not. That isn't about my health care. That's about their power.
And when you look at the mandatory spending, when you put Social Security and I mean, we're talking 70, 80% of our budget is really mandatory spending. So Congress doesn't have much to say many times, do they?
They do, except that they won't accept the responsibility. The author, every one of these programs was written by an authorizing committee. It's within the jurisdiction of those committees. Those committees could do a disciplined oversight of those programs, and they should be doing. They should be doing what has been going on in Washington today. They should have been doing that all. We should have forensic accounting and examining the books of every agency of this government. But again, you see, it's just turn it over to the bureaucrats and just let them know. The bureaucrats got the same intention as if they owned a restaurant down the street. They want to make it bigger. They want to make it bigger. And so Congress doesn't do the oversight that it should be done. And they could amend these programs. The requirement that if you don't join Social Security at the same time you sign up for Medicare, you lose your Social Security is not in the law. It's not in the regulations. It's the ongoing enforcement of a memorandum that was written. Now, Congress should be deeply offended by that. Who do these people think they are? They can rewrite the law by a simple memorandum, don't even have decency to put it in the regulations where it's subject to review. But Congress, I fought for years to get them to pay some attention to it and could get nobody to consider.
Do you think the DOGE committee is making progress or has made progress? Maybe with Elon Musk out, they might continue. I think I've seen some things that seem to be making a lot of sense. I saw the other day where they're implementing AI, where they said they could cut about half the workforce related to regulation and monitoring things related to implementing regulations, et cetera, that are required by industry. It seems to make a lot of sense to me.
I think Elon Musk and his group have done a marvelous job. And the fact is, they set a good example before us. And if for no other reason than appreciation of all the graft, the corruption, the waste, the inefficiency, and just plain outright looting that they've uncovered, we ought to have a national commitment to carry this kind of a procedure more thoroughly through in the future and more rigorously applied. What an example before us. And he should be appreciated. Instead, they're wanting to burden down his dealerships.
Yeah, crazy. Leader Armey, we're going to go to the break. When we come back, I want to pick up on a couple other, we want to talk about President George Bush and Dick Armey almost became a presidential candidate. At least Kevin Kramer and I were rooting back here in North Dakota at one point. I want to talk about that. We're finishing up this segment talking about serving in the majority, wrapping up the leadership that changes. But Leader Armey, one president we didn't talk about was George Bush 43, and there were some challenges of, you had some run-ins with him back with his father. And I actually like Bush 43 and in lots of ways, but I didn't like Karl Rove's operation, and I think that did so much to affect, I think, the way George Bush W, I guess we call him. But anyway, talk a little bit about your impression of him and his role in being president.
I'm not very kind. I'm going to just be candid. I think he's a smart, aleck, preppy boy who all his life has had skids greased for him. He's too big for his britches. He's not respectful of other people and never made an inch of ground on his own hoof in his entire life. He's just exactly the opposite of the kind of people I grew up that had to make every bit of your way along your own terms as best you could, not having everything all the way paid for you. No, I guess I said it. I don't have much use for the guy. I don't think he amounts to much.
At one point when he was running, there was talk about your people were encouraging you to get in the presidential race. And of course, problem with U.S. senators, they all think they should be the president. And I don't know about the House and Congress, but you were the leader. You're the majority leader. You were a thinker. You understood many processes and people really respected you. You would have done an amazing job leading. Talk to us a little bit about, there was interest by some people to encourage you to run. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's always that. I think you have to really make a very sober assessment of that. And I reintroduced the flat tax back in '94. And I think at that time, had I run on the flat tax, I might have made a pretty good impression. It was run by Steve Forbes, picked up my flat tax and ran. Here's a man that had lived a life of studied anonymity, and he did pretty well with it. So that I think that might have been the time I might have considered running. But the fact of the matter is, there was no time at any point where a sober reflection didn't quickly bring me to the conclusion I didn't have a chance of being elected in this country. It just couldn't happen. And why would I divert my time and energy away from the important work I was privileged to do, to be going chasing a rainbow that was simply just not within my reach? So there is, all right, it falls into the category of wouldn't it be lovely? It wasn't. And so I had work to do, and I stayed on the job.
You talked at length about the crowded field when George Bush ran, and a lot of people chasing rainbows, and to your point, that really had no interest, but they liked the resume to say presidential candidate and those kind of things, which really plays into politics, doesn't it? The way the mindset and the egos that go into that.
Oh, yeah, you have to be careful. Every one of us, I had a pretty good following around the country, and naturally I'd go to Pittsburgh or I'd go to Indiana, and a crowd of people that was primarily a group of people that came there because they appreciated me. Yeah, you all night long, you ought to run for president. You ought to run for president. That's always nice. It's comforting, but the fact of the matter is you're talking about less than 0.5% of the voting population, and even then, that would be further cut in half when they had to juxtapose you against somebody else that they've been telling they ought to run for president. So you just can't let that stuff go to your head. It's destructive. It's hurtful. And I've seen people get all swelled up with each other or with themselves over that. Take it for what it is. It's a very nice compliment from very nice people, and you ought to appreciate that. But don't be starting to raise money on it.
I love your comment, and talk to us about your dinner you had when your wife encouraged you to sit by Tom Selleck, and you wanted her to sit by Tom Selleck. And you're a member of Congress, you're in the House, and they're talking about U.S. senators. Talk to us a little bit about some of that mindset that goes with being the U.S. senator, because I've talked to people before, and in fact, the U.S. Senator Kevin Cramer said, he's been in the House, he said, I'm telling you, when you get in the Senate, it's a different ballgame. And, and you could speak to that, but I love this Tom Selleck story.
This Tom Selleck story, by the way, he's a wonderful man to visit with. But he was noticing that when a senator came in the room, everybody jumped out of their seat and they hovered around him and so forth. And he looked at me, he said, boy, these senators get a lot of attention, don't they? I said, yeah, Tom, I always tell my friends in the House when they're running for the Senate, I'm not a big enough horse's rear to be a senator, but I think you got the potential for the job. We had a laugh. Then the senator comes down, sits at the table right across from Tom. And very soon after he sits down, he looks across the table and says, Tom, you ought to run for Senate. You'd make a very good senator. And I said, yeah, Tom, you've got the potential for the job. He and I cracked up. My wife was kicking my shin off. And the senator were just sitting around saying, gee, I wonder what I said that was so funny. And finally he said, "That's enough about me. Let's talk about you. What do you think of me?"
That's fabulous. Having been leader and been in those positions, you meet a lot of interesting people. I've been blessed to meet a lot of interesting people, but mine are small potatoes. But when you've been leader, as you have, that's a pretty fascinating story. And I'd like to work in some of those stories related to your life while there's such a serious nature to what's going on in the country. And I'm going to pivot the last segment before we let you get on your motorcycle and head to the Smoky Mountains. I want to talk about your brother, Charlie. In the book, you talk about your brother, Charlie. Now, I mentioned earlier in a previous segment, I grew up being a Los Angeles Rams fan. Roman Gabriel, I go back to the 60s. I was a Los Angeles Rams fan. And the Rams had a terrible time for years. Couldn't win the Super Bowl. They end up in St. Louis. I finally gave up on them. I said, you know what? I'm giving up on the Rams because they gave up on Los Angeles, so it's not on me. All of a sudden, Kurt Warner shows up, and I'm going like, whoa, these guys they got something going on here. I never really knew anything about your brother until Senator Kramer, who was in the Senate at the time, told me about Charlie. And so let's talk about that a little bit, because he helped me be a proud Rams fan again.
Yeah, Charlie actually discovered Kurt Warner. Kurt Warner had been the high school quarterback, or had been the college quarterback of a guy who had been Charlie's high school quarterback. And Charlie discovered him, and Charlie fought for him, and Kurt Warner would not have been starting in the NFL if it hadn't been for Charlie Armey. And that story is well documented. But Charlie had a special talent for scouting, and the players had a special affinity for him. He's just a good person. And when the Rams hired him, Dick Gephardt was on the board of the Rams, Dick Gephardt being the then Senate and House Democrat leader. I said to Gephardt, my brother just joined the Rams. He'll take him to the Super Bowl in just a few years. And of course, I'm shooting out my mouth. And Charlie made it good for me. But anyway, Charlie has always been my closest sibling. We always are so considerate of each other. And when I look back on my book, then I began to look back on Charlie's life, and the sameness of our lives fascinates me. And it's because those experiences you have in your childhood, in your community, pretty much left the same imprint on us. And you see a reflection of having been raised in Can-Do, in both Charlie and me, in the way we conduct ourselves throughout our careers. It's quite intriguing to me. I keep trying to get Charlie to write his memoirs. It's not that hard a thing to do, because it should be very fascinating if he were to sit down and tell all his war stories.
When you look at how America is so obsessed with sports and football, that people would love his story, because he's got quite a journey how he worked through it. And he started out, wasn't it NDSU? He was at NDSU for a while and worked his way up through the national college level and the pros.
He did his master's at North Dakota State, and I was with him on the field in Arlington, Texas, where North Dakota State won their first championship.
Oh my gosh! That's
and
phenomenal.
he was a graduate student attached to the football coaching thing, and I forget the name of the coach, Ron, whatever it was. He, by the way, was a Jamestown College graduate, which obviously was to the benefit of NDSU. I don't know how they got along without us, but at any rate.
You know about Jamestown, and you have a long history. And plus, you're a big Viking fan. There's another pretty famous running back. So Josh Haugen, who was in studio last week when we recorded your show, another Can-Do boy, famous Can-Do boy. But he was reminding me of another famous running back for the Vikings from Can-Do. Do you recall who that was?
Dave Osborne. I still have a scar on my side where his Shetland pony bit me when we were kids out on the farm. And we're so proud of Dave. He did such a good job. And when you look at the competition that he had to overcome from the large schools and so forth, I'm always proud of him. I got a lot of Aussie paraphernalia around and so forth. I was the one that discovered the article where Dick Butkus named the and Bill Brown as the hardest running backs to tackle and how they gave it back to him. And I had somehow called that to his attention. He made him feel good to get that kind of a compliment from Butkus. I think I took the article and sent it to him.
That's phenomenal. Those can-do boys have done quite well, so we appreciate that. I think we got a picture of your motorcycle up here I want to bring forward. I hope I got the right one. So this is your bike.
Yes, there it is. Isn't she a beauty?
This is all right, 85 years old, and this is my new ride. I'm taking it to Smoky Mountains next week. So we wanted just to put that picture up there to send you off and look forward to a picture of you on it while you're riding through the Smoky Mountains, or at least have it sitting there in front of some gas station or maybe even a nice little restaurant.
I'll come up with something.
Well, Leader Armey, we appreciate you joining us. Thanks for being with us. We're going to do one more episode and wrap this series up with you. We appreciate you joining us. You stay safe out there across the country driving that bike through those winding roads, all right?
Okay, and if I don't stay in touch with you, you get in touch with me because I'm getting a little forgetful in my old age.
I promise you I will track you down, sir. So stay safe. So we've been talking to Leader Dick Armey on the Horn. I'm your host, Gary Emineth. Thanks for watching.